Great. Welcome to everybody who's streaming via YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. You've joined the 12 noon Bible study hosted by Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church. I was just saying that we're going to be looking at the biblical text, 1 Kings chapter 8 and 9, and Dr. Fentress-Williams' book, Holy Imagination. We're going to be looking at pages 113 through 116. And if you're looking at a digital copy of the Holy Imagination book, it's coming maybe about halfway between the test of the Queen of Sheba from the Solomon stories in chapter 10, maybe about halfway between that and the end is a paragraph that starts with Solomon's story is structured by the Deuteronomist. So welcome everybody. If you are on the YouTube streaming channel and you want to participate on the Zoom side, we sometimes use a chat over here to have some additional perspectives and questions entered into our conversation that's happening on the Zoom platform. We would love it if you have perspectives or questions or just things that you want to add, comments you want to add. If you add them on the YouTube side, we have a representative from Metropolitan who will be looking back and forth and will populate the Zoom chat with your question or comment, and then we can at least include it into this side of the conversation. All right, y'all, it is September 28th, the end of September, my goodness. Okay, so let's start with prayer. And then I think the way we'll start today is I was looking at kind of 5 major categories, and maybe we could, just start with one of them. We'll jump into the Holy Imagination book, wherever that part starts, and then we'll go from there. We'll see what the time holds for us. All right, let's pray. Dear God, thank you so much that by the time we call upon your name, you are already amongst us. Thank you that you've not only promised to be with 2 or more of us, but that you, through your word and through your experiences, we believe that you want to be with us, that it's not just a promise that you keep, but that a promise that you want to keep. Would you help us to create this time to be so much more than just a to-do list? Oh, we did Bible study and check it off. That we might be more of who we've been created and called to be because we met with one another and we met with you. Thank you, oh God, you can create a miracle over Zoom, over YouTube, and even through words on a page. Thank you that you want to be with us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, y'all. Okay, so there's a lot going on in these 3 pages of Holy Imagination, or 4 pages. There's a lot that's kicking up, and that's because there's a lot going on in 1st and 2nd Kings. There's all of this work that's coming, as we've been talking about over time, this Deuteronomistic theology and history and perspective that is driving a lot of this. And so we can see, even in the different kinds of patterns that show up, we can see that interpretive lens coming through. That helps us to notice what fits, but it also helps us notice where there are things that don't quite fit, and then we can address those, right? Sometimes the biggest revelations can come from the things that don't fit the pattern, but just being aware of the pattern and being willing to be explicit about it and how we're interpreting things allows us to dig deeper than if we just tried to find one story that fit everything. So anyway, we have this interpretive lens that's still driving 1st and 2nd Kings. So in Holy Imagination on page 113, she begins to talk about Solomon's story, or the stories around Solomon are theologically explained political realities, right? So she says the literary and theological depictions of Solomon explain a political reality, namely that the tribes united under David did not hold together for long, right? So folks are like, if God is behind all of this, right, and God is all powerful, how come the tribe split up, right? So, you've got to navigate that somehow, right? Folks are going to have questions. There's a question that comes up perennially for people who believe in an all-powerful God. And it's the one of like, how can bad things happen to good people when there's an all good, all knowing, all powerful God, right? That question keeps coming up because folks are trying to figure it out. Like, how is it possible that this could be true and this reality is right in front of my face, right? And as long as nobody good or that we're categorizing as good around us is experiencing bad things, we can just go about our business, right? But as soon as somebody like close to us or somebody we didn't expect, we're like, hey, what's going on, right? We're going to see that play out in Job. We're going to see it play all the way out. And that's when this Deuteronomistic theology starts getting challenged explicitly, right? But for right now, we've got folks who are like, how come the kingdom split? Are we still dealing with the same God who, said that, if we were obedient and we did these things, and even when we didn't, that this promise to David's house was going to be sustained, right? So we've got that going on. Then we've got the actual split, the north-south split. And in addition to that, there's a power dynamic, a power play going on, right? The north has certain things that make it powerful. And even though the south is smaller, it also has things that make it powerful, right? We could talk about that. The third thing is kind of talking about what I've already brought up, but specifically, Dr. Fentress-Williams brings up the editing of kings, this Deuteronomy history theology that is editing kings and where that's coming from. So we could touch that specifically. The fourth thing that I thought was like really, I don't know, maybe I'm just geeking out over it, right? But right after the north and the sin of Jeroboam section starts, right, about halfway through, it talks about, it was the image selected to represent El, right? This is the two golden calves, right? The king puts that into place because they've got a worship problem now, right? They've got a worship problem by geography. They've got the split. Where are folks going to worship? Jeroboam's like, look, I can take care of this. I'll just have a couple of golden calves put together and folks can still worship, right? Now, there's all sorts of consequences to that, right? But what Dr. Fentress-Williams is bringing up says the calf was a symbol associated with fertility and strength in the ancient Near East. It was the image selected to represent El, the head of Canaanite pantheon. And it also represented Baal, the storm god and son of El. So I thought one possible way to get into this part of the conversation would be to talk about how many names of Yahweh also start with El. El Shaddai, Elohim, all the L's, right? That could be a place we could go, right? Everyone's like, what did you say, Michelle? Stop it. Okay, that may be too controversial today. All right, here we go. Number 5 is like how Samaria shows up again, right? We've got a lot of stories in the Christian Testament that bring up Samaria and all the things going on with Samaria. Samaria is showing up here. So we could talk about like a connection between those two things. So the 5 things are this like theological and literary way to talk about political realities, the north-south split and the power dynamic that's going on there, the editing of kings, the whole L thing, and Samaria. So what do you think? Is one of those 5 things strike anybody's fancy right away, or was there something else you're like, Michelle, you totally missed the coolest part? You could tell I was totally geeking out over this. I don't know why. It's not like it's my favorite. I just geeked out.
Why do you think it's so important about how many names for God that start with L?
Oh, because El is the head of the Canaanite pantheon. We're talking about a theology that says do not worship foreign gods. But then we also have a whole bunch of names for the God that is described as the one and only true God that begin with L. So there's some sort of crossover going on there. At the very least, folks are using language that they already know to then describe this particular God, Yahweh.
Yeah, well, you know, I just think there's always crossover and, you know, borrowing from other cultures and practices all the time. And
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with it. So I don't get so upset about it, but others might. So that's just my input on that. I think it's okay. You know, we have all these symbols, the lamb all the way through, and that seems to be okay. But this is not okay. So it's just whatever strikes our fancy kind of thing, or whatever prevails.
Right. And I think, Sister Marion, I think part of what you're bringing up is the reality of what happens, right? There are some interpretations in some Christian communities that are very nervous around this. They get very nervous around this because, well, there's probably a whole host of reasons. One reason is that this is showing up in the midst of this very distinctual, like it's either this or it's this. You're either obeying God or you're not, right? And this God has said to these folks, right, in different ways, don't worship other gods. So what happens sometimes, the way that communities will interpret these texts, is that any single thing that seems to fall into that disobedience category or the worshiping of other gods category gets demonized, right? That it can't possibly be good, it can't possibly be right. And a lot of that either or thinking comes from this Deuteronomy thing. And even though it gets challenged in Job real hard, it's even Job sometimes, the book of Job is interpreted based on this Deuteronomy theology, right? So okay, so let me, I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but okay, let's do this. I do this in other areas of my work around implicit bias, but if what I'm going to do is I'm going to say something, and in the Zoom chat, would you write down the first one or two things you think of, right? The first one or two words that you think of when I say the word that I'm going to say, okay? Just whatever they are, the first one or two things, zip them into the chat and we'll talk about it a little bit, okay? So here's the thing. Koala. Koala bear. If I say koala bear, what's the first or second word that comes to your mind in the Zoom? Okay, so we have Australia, a whole bunch of Australias, cuddly thing, yep. Anything else? Anything else first come to your mind? Like the first one or two things. Adorable, yeah. Small, not a bear. Awesome, these are good. Cuddly. And it was written kind of like that, cuddly, no. It was like trying to put some like phonetics into it. That's nice. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of Australias, cuddly thing, adorable, small, not a bear, cuddly again, right? And zoo, yeah, excellent. So the reason that we have a lot of these similar kinds of words and similar kinds of themes come up is because we've been trained in a narrative about the koala bear, okay? Now, here's the thing. If when you see like an animal expert or something on like a morning show or a talk show or something, and they bring out the koala bear, if you pay close attention, you'll notice that the animal expert will kind of shift their body so that their body is between the animal and the host, right? Then, in addition to that, often they're eating what? The koala's eating what? Unmute.
Nuts?
No. Bamboo is close.
Eucalyptus.
Eucalyptus. Right. So the koala is usually eating eucalyptus. And since we're in a church environment, I'm going to say this carefully. Eucalyptus is a mellowing agent. So when the koala comes out looking all chill and calm and everything, right, chewing on the eucalyptus, it's because the koala bear is now chill and calm, right? So there's all these things set up, right? There's the body language of the animal expert, like, oh, take it easy. If the host like kind of reaches out, there's drugged. Exactly. So just feeling good, Sister Marion, just feeling good. So anyway, all of these different things, right? Because the koala bear is actually ferocious, can be ferocious, especially when it's protecting its family. So there are different things that happen so that the koala bear and the talk show host and the animal expert and all of the lawyers, are happy, right? But the narrative of the koala bear is so strong that even folks that know about the ferocity of the koala bear will still, when I ask for the first or second thing in an implicit bias workshop, will still name these, right? The ferocious part usually doesn't come until like the 5th, 6th, or 7th word. Like if I was saying, take 15 seconds and write down all the words that come to your mind, it would show up like down here. Okay. Now I'm going to say one more thing about it. Who said it? Let's see. Sister Marcia. Sister Marcia said, not a bear, right? I say koala bear, right? Now I do it purposely, but for years, okay? It was like, it had to be at least 2 years. I was doing this particular exercise in implicit bias workshops, and I would always say koala bear. Now, when we did this in person, I'd be up front saying, okay, popcorn them out, right? I'd say 15 seconds, hurry up, go, write all your words. Then I'd say, okay, start naming them from the top of your list. Go, 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 go. And I'd be like this. Okay, yes, we've got Australia, we've got eucalyptus, we've got this, we've got that, we've got this, we've got not a bear. What else? Koala bear, what else? Right? Now, I would do that a couple times in a row. Literally, I would say, not a bear. Yes. Now, koala bear. Anything else? In the midst of facilitating an implicit bias workshop. And it was only after a couple of years that I realized that my own narrative of it being called a koala bear still needed 2 years of implicit bias facilitation for me to realize what I was doing in the moment, right? This narrative is so strong. The reason that we did one, because it's fun, right? But also, this also points to the strength of that Deuteronomistic theology. It's, as humans, we want to make sense of things. We want to do that. Our brains are going to drive us there. Our survival instincts are going to drive us there. And the Deuteronomistic history provides a set of answers that sometimes helps to quell that, right? Helps to satisfy that, at least initially, right? If I don't want bad, this is how it plays out, right? If I don't want bad things to happen, make sure I do the good things. And because I can control what I do or don't do to a certain extent, then I can be more in control about whether or not bad things happen to me and the folks around me, right? That is an incredibly strong narrative. It's an incredibly strong temptation that has to be actively challenged, because it takes over Bible studies everywhere. and it especially takes over when we're in periods of immediacy, right? So it'd either be like immediacy of crisis, when we're hungry, when we're tired, when we're scared, when we're mad, when we're pressed for time. All of those things create situations where we will go to our go-to. right? So whatever the thing is that we would automatically go to, that's the thing we'll go to. So if we're grieving and we're trying to make sense of something, we're going to go to our go-to, right? And for a lot of people, a lot of Christians, a lot of religious folks, that Deuteronomistic history is the thing. So all that to say, go back to Sister Marion's comment, right? It's like, well, that doesn't mean that doesn't concern me, right? The whole idea of like the name of El being associated with a God that is also described with the name of Yahweh, right? It's like, well, things are shared and crossed over and all different kinds of ways, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And that's very true. It happens in all different areas, right? But people get super protective over their religion. Super protective.
Yeah, I don't mean to say it doesn't mean anything. I just think it's.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's just a natural evolution of cultures living next to each other.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I misspoke. That's my fault. I'm sorry about that. Right. It's not that you didn't mean that it means nothing. It's just that it doesn't crush your spirituality or your religion or your understanding of the world either. Yeah, that's good. Thank you for the correction too. I appreciate that. What do you all think about that? Well, y'all are just so forward thinking and critical reflecting folk. That's what it is. Y'all like, psh, that's just, we're already beyond that.
No, I know. I know some people find that upsetting and call me, well, I don't know, names because I'm not so strict about that. So undisciplined or not, or they perceive it as I'm thinking it doesn't care. It doesn't matter, like you said, which really is not what I mean to get across. I just mean that I think we need to have a very strong tolerance of others and other customs because we blend them all so seamlessly and yet still criticize someone for seemingly doing something differently.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just say something?
Sure.
I was interrupted with a phone call. A good friend of mine, Judith, is in the hospital, and they were reporting back to me that she was okay. So that's why. And I wanted to raise her in a prayer concern anyway. But I'm jumping into our conversation. God is God. Whatever name we call that is God. Now, Allah, whatever. It's God. And we may not like that, but I think there is one God. And however we worship or whatever we do is up to us. But there's just, in my book, one God. And that's okay.
Well, and that's one theology too, right, Sister Janine? Like even just saying there's only one God and whatever you name that God is pointing to the same God, that's a particular theology.
Yeah.
Right? So because there are, even just in scholarship alone, right, there are ways that like some folks consider that theology disrespectful of the way that they worship, because a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times what happens is that the way that Christians understand God, certain Christians, right, will basically that theology subsumes all the others through the lens of Christianity, right?
Yes.
So there are ways that we talk about that, right? So one of the sentences that you shared, one of the phrases that you offered, especially right at the end there, was like, that's how I think about it, right? So even by saying that, then creates the particular of that, which is helpful, right? It creates the ability to be able to have a conversation about different ways to think about theology and describing God.
Okay.
But yeah, because some people around the globe think or worship multiple gods, right? So yeah. So again, I mean, these are some of the questions that that are important to dig into, to work with, right? Because we could talk about, we could talk about the North and South and the sin of Jeroboam, and you either do right or you don't, or whatever, and we could just leave it at that, and that would give us a pretty superficial way of thinking about it. Is it, can we point to the text? Sure. Does it also include the realities of how we interact with one another and what happens on the ground as we try to live into, our beliefs as Christians? It's going to get messier. Sister Marion, please.
Well, one of the things that that I've learned in this Bible study this year is how strongly held was the notion that there were multiple gods. I mean, I didn't really appreciate that until we went, digging deep, and through with this book, Holy Imagination. So, in the law, one of the things that professors in law school tell you, when there's a law, a really strong law saying thou shalt not, or whatever, it's because people have done the what you shall not do.
Good.
So, so this big emphasis on I'm the only God, blah, 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 blah. To me, always, now that I read this, having been in this class now all summer, is like, that's because there was a whole lot of argument saying the opposite. So it wasn't universally held. It wasn't a universally held notion that there's just one God.
Mm-hmm. And Sister Mary, let's open it up. Let's take what you just said a little bit further, right? So thou shalt not is usually countering what a not that is. Right?
Behavior. It's countering behavior.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's something going on that folks are like, we're going to say no to that. Right.
Right.
What do you think is the concern? Right? Because usually folks are not just arbitrary. I mean, after generations or whatever, and it gets passed down, then people can arbitrarily be like, you just don't do that. And then when you ask why, they're like, I don't know, you just don't. But when it starts, right? When it starts, they're countering it for a particular reason. What do you, based on what we've been reading and how this theology is being pressed forward, what do y'all think is going on there? Why do you think they think it's a bad idea?
I think it's political.
Okay, say more, please.
Well, I think, so me and my friends, we're fighting against those other people over there because they have the grain fields that we want, but they also happen to worship, half a dozen gods. Well, let's counter that. Let's just say that they have a bad way of a bad kind of theology. They have bad farming practices. Ours is the only way, and let's go after them. Let's try to convince other people that ours is the best way.
And then a theology that says, if you do the right stuff, good things will come to you.
Right. We'll construct
backs that up.
We'll construct a whole thought process that supports our way.
Very good. Yeah, nice.
We got it.
Other thoughts around that? Brother Carlos, here. Jump
Okay, I think it's some of that is identity too. How can we look different from everybody else? If we have that one God, it helps identify and keep us together as opposed to looking like everybody else, I think.
Okay, and why is that important? Why is it important with regards to identity to be different than those other folk? Or why? How could it be good? Worth it?
It's a way to rally the troops.
Okay.
Brother Carlos, were you going to say something else?
Oh, she answered.
Yeah. Yeah. Because so have you ever heard of the strategy like of the common enemy? Yeah. Right? It's like let's say you've got a group, right? And they're splintered all over the place. Right? They're just like infighting and all sorts of stuff going on or whatever, right? And then they end up in war or something, right? Then everybody comes together. I mean, there's probably narratives within this country that follow that. So then the common enemy comes and everybody comes together and says, well, let's focus all our rage and attention over there. And then for at least a temporary period of time, maybe even a superficial way, the group is united. Yeah, I like that. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Oh, Sister Mary says World War II. Look. And
It
so
could
many
also
others.
show that they have favor with whoever the God is. They're the ones, when they identify themselves as the one, they're the ones that have the favor. They're unlike the identity of the others who are honoring all of these other gods. We have one God, and that God shows us favor, and it's proven by David's being able to kill everybody, the Philistines and everyone else, and being a great warrior, and as well as giving Solomon the wisdom that he had and making him the king. All of the things that were bestowed to Solomon were as a result of God's promise to David. And we find that Solomon kind of screwed up a little bit when he started going with the foreign women, but God still showed favor because of the promise that he had made to David. So.
Yes, Dr. Bowling, thank you so much for bringing that forward.
I'd just like to add one thing, and it's sort of unrelated, but I just gotta say it.
Okay, wait, if it's unrelated though, can it wait until after this part?
Yeah, it can.
Okay.
I don't want to forget it.
Oh, okay. Well, jot a note. So what's being affiliated with this God, right? Who keeps seemingly keeps showing up, right? In ways that they can't explain otherwise, right? You know, it's interesting. When we were going to pick the eldest son, that didn't work out. But then God picked the youngest son, and the youngest son, you know, was really killing it, right? Or we thought it was supposed to go this way, but then this God, through this prophet, said, do this other thing. Barren women are having children. What in the world is going on, right? So not only is it like we're getting favor from this particular God, so we're going to worship this God, but also there are some things we can't explain any other kind of way and at the same time when we keep thinking that it's because of this particular God. So why would we mess around with a whole bunch of different gods that are doing their own thing when this one does things that are miraculous and keep showing up in our favor, like Dr. Bowling said, in our favor, favoring us? Yeah. Sister Janine, tell us your note.
Well, until we read this in the Bible about the women coming to with the baby arguing, I had never heard them described as prostitutes. Never. The story was always these two women came, and I'm really shocked. But it's kind of interesting that it was prostitutes, you know. And that they could come and talk to the king about this, because in our society, you know, we just think they're dirt. You know, I just, it's a whole different way of looking at people that I kind of like. I just wanted to toss it in. I mean, I was really surprised.
Okay.
Well,
yeah, and oh, go ahead, Brother Thomas.
We had a discussion in our men's school class around this topic of prostitutes. And it was mentioned that that is the world's oldest profession. And that during that time, it was looked upon differently, perhaps, than it is today. To Janine's point, that it would not be so unusual for a king to entertain conversations with prostitutes. After all, his one of his functions was to judge, right, between people. So he didn't discriminate because they happened to be prostitutes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't. You know, all these conversations kind of squish together in my mind. So last week, I did the 12 and the 7 p.m. So I can't remember where it showed up, but I do remember we talked about first of all, there are different Talmudic writings around it, right? Where rabbis are just going back and forth and be like, well, what if it was this? What if it was this? And there was this whole thing about the two women being daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. And if it was daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, the whole idea of like the age of the sons, right? The daughter-in-law didn't have because there was no one else in the house, right? So that meant that the daughter-in-law by law was to wait for that other son to grow up in order to marry, right? Because that's the only way that she could get protection through that system. And so by her switching the babies out, right? Then there was no other son to grow up that she had to wait for and marry, right? We also talked about how, it just my brain fell out. We also talked about some other stuff.
We also talked at the very end of the Noonday last week, and I couldn't join in on 7 o'clock, but Yvonne talked about we were always talking about how wise Solomon was, but that mother was pretty wise too, in saying, let him live, let the other woman have the child. And I had never thought of that either.
She reminded us it was love that.
I mean, she was as smart as Solomon,
right?
Now that Yvonne brought that out, thank you, Yvonne.
Dr. Bowling comes through again. Yeah, and
it just shows you how women aren't listened to, or our decisions are not as valued as the male decisions, and we shouldn't allow that.
Yeah, and so the other thing that I just remembered kind of coincides with that a little bit too, right? So they've got these two women who are living in the house. There's no one else there, right? They both have young children. We don't know what they're doing to make money, right? But they're doing something because they're surviving, right? And now these two women that are under no control of men now are raising two sons. We wondered last week if it could be possible that the writer wouldn't have had a nomenclature for those women, wouldn't have known what to do, right? How else do we name these women that are doing things independently of men? We have different ways to talk about that, but most, if none of them, are good, right? They don't have like good standing. It's like, well, they must be prostitutes, right? Or they're prostitutes. They're doing whatever they need to do, blah, 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 right? They're living, a lot of times, like when we were looking at Rahab, right? Prostitute or something like that is literally the word to describe a woman that is not living within the lines of whatever the patriarchal law is, right? So if women are living outside of that, they're called harlot, prostitute. And now when we hear that language, just like the koala bear, right? When we hear that language, it's overtly sexual, right? We're thinking of sex workers at that point, right? Which also brings in Sister Janine's comment, right? How we think about sex workers. If we're thinking sex positively, or if we're thinking about agency, the agency of sex workers, like the ability to choose for oneself, then we're thinking about it totally different than if we're thinking about people who are desperately just trying to find a way to make money, right? Through sex, through the sexual giving or sharing or offering of the body, right? And that gears us to think differently, right? Now, I know this sounds like we're way all over the place, but the reality is, like, every single biblical text, including this one that Dr. Fentress-Williams talks about specifically, there is an interpretive lens that is telling the story, right? And part of what we're doing is extricating the interpretive lens of any of these stories that we've been bringing up, right? And in doing so, we can really wrestle with the text and wrestle with our own implicit or explicit biases. Brother Charles, I see you trying to come in.
Can a part-time skeptic
Please.
just say something? Suppose there were no two women. Suppose there were no two babies, that someone just wrote the story to make Solomon look good.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, because Fentress keeps talking about the legends. And I'm
The what? She keeps talking about the what?
Legends, the legend of this and it's several times in her
Sure.
book.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, well, but you know, they did build those towers and things, you know, they, you know, great places of worship. I can't remember the name for it. So that did happen. Those things happened. But, and then they were, you know, knocked down or whatever. But still, archaeologists are telling us, yeah, they were there. So
One of the
Right.
reasons I said that
Right.
was, I don't think those women were named. And in many cases, you find the women at the well, you find, you know, but you don't put a story to them, but the stories to Rahab, Tamar, and all of those, you put a name to those, but just two people living together and had two babies, you know, it doesn't go any further.
Yeah, and it very well might be. One of the questions around that interpretation would have to do with how many unnamed women, though, there are in the Bible, right? So it's not unusual that there are unnamed women, that even that they would have a story around them would be significant. At the very same time, Brother Charles, there are ways that narrative stories are brought forward to tell a story, right? Or to make a point. And now in 2022, you know, we're more, we focus more on which things happen historically to be shown as evidence of truth than oral traditions historically have been, right? So when we're talking about things that come through oral tradition, and even just different ways of telling stories, there are truths that are coming through the story, right? It could be, oh, you know how like sometimes we'll watch a movie and it'll be like, this is based on a true story or whatever, but you know, like going in, especially if it says it was based on a true story, you know, there are other things going on, right? And then some critics are still going to get all bent out of shape. Did you see how they represented the blah, blah, right? It's like, yo, in the beginning, they said this is only based on, right? So we get all caught up in that now. But this, Brother Charles, I think you bring forward a great point. There are ways of telling truths or even propaganda, which maybe is where you were going, right? There are ways of telling that through storytelling, but they may not have any historical reference. Yeah. Sister Marion, please. This is good.
Well, you know, we keep saying that there were just the two women in the house, but do we know that for a fact? That I went back and read it. Okay, it's my version says that there was no stranger with us in the house, save we two in the house. So, you know, does that mean? Because usually in those days, here we go. Often I've been told that people didn't live necessarily alone because you needed, you know, everyone needed to pitch in for a household to succeed. So are we so convinced that those were the only two people in the house or two women in the house?
Right. And then what does the difference mean? Right? Like even when we talked about this last week, you know, part of, I don't know, 12 o'clock or 7 o'clock, not sure. But one of those times, you know, we talked about like, why would that be important? Right? Why is that part of the story even there? Because we only have, you know, yes, it's a big book, right? It's big, but there's only so many stories in there. And there's only so many books. And a whole bunch of people got together centuries ago and decided which books were going to show up in anyway, right? So there were other books that were like up for nomination and didn't make it, right? They've got stories in there. And the folks that chose the canon were human beings, right? So they had interpretations and interpretive lenses that they were using to decide, should this be considered sacred text?
And they were
Right?
men.
And they were men. And right. And then we've got all the different translations and all of that. And none of that means that truth isn't coming forward through it, or that God isn't speaking to, in, through, despite us with it, right? All of those things can be true. There are some communities that get very nervous with talk like this, right? This doesn't happen to be one of them. Because we're looking at one of the interpretive lenses that we're using is critical reasoning, right? We're doing a whole bunch of that. And we're saying, like, we can take into consideration all these different things, and it doesn't take away from the relationship that we have with God, that God has with us, and that we can't learn truth about the world, about God, about us, and each other. But there are some communities that get really nervous about that. Whoa, this all started with a conversation about L. This is good. Brother Thomas, jump in, please.
I was going to say that what's important to me is not the story in itself, but what do I take away?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
From any of the stories in the Bible?
Yeah.
Charles makes a great point, but at the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. That's a great point to be taken from this. Doesn't matter to me whether the author took creative license in using that as a particular illustration. What's important is what I take away from it is the love that this woman had, that she was really willing to say, okay, you take my baby because I'd rather see the baby live. Mm-hmm. In that particular example.
So could that also be known as truth, right? When there is love present to a certain extent, right? Not even just saying it has to be a parent or a mother or anything like that, right? But just talking about the kind of interaction or care for another that reaches the point where someone would sacrifice their own happiness or their own needs in order to protect another, right? There's some, I would say that there's a truth in that. There's part of humanity that can tap into that comes out at certain times. And then we might also describe that as an aspect of human character or humanity that we want to aim toward, that we want to live into and live out of, right? Brother Thomas, don't go on mute, please. Jump back in. What do you think about that?
I agree.
Okay.
I mean,
because truth sometimes is limited to like particular evidences, right?
Right. I'll go back to the example you gave about movies. This story is based on.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of illustrations of this story is based on throughout the Bible.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Sister Leandra, you want to jump in?
I was going to say that Jesus used a lot of parables, and they didn't necessarily, they were just stories to drive home a certain point. But they did try to, he used parables depending on who he was talking to so they could relate to the story. And so it didn't necessarily have to be, the person's name that was in the story, but that story could have happened to this particular population, whoever you were talking to, like all of the stories that he talked about, things that were related to farmers, and then even with Paul, when he uses analogies about races and things, running the race for life. That the whole point is that there is some truth to it, and we don't need. I don't think we need to be concerned about who the individuals are, because our goal is to find out what the ultimate truth is that God wants us to get out of this. And also I want to say that I believe that all Scripture is inspired by God. And humans, when we write it down, we are biased, so we're going to try to make things relate to our world, or our way of thinking. And because when I was in Mr. Ely's class, I'm still in his class. He always said that we had to decide on which version of the Bible we were going to use, and because some versions were tainted by people, but all versions, in my opinion, can be tainted. And he always said, "Oh, we have to use the NIV because the King James had, his thoughts and his desires for power or whatever, thrown into that interpretation." So, like Brother Nicholson was saying, we need to look at what the ultimate story is, and I think it is. All of these boil down to love conquers whatever situation we're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just hold on 1 second. So just being explicit also about what those things are, right? So you read the King James Version, and if you're explicit about what King James was about when he had that translation put together, then you can be on the lookout for it. Right?
Yeah.
You'd be like, oh yeah, that's what's showing up right there. And that's why it shows up different in NIV. And that's why it shows up different in the NRSV, because they have that different thing. Sister Janine, hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Sister Marion had her hand up. Yes, please. Ooh,
Well, I always find it interesting that when the movies come out, say about the life of Christ or other stories from the Bible, the greatest story ever told. And I say, yes, the greatest story ever told.
Yeah.
That's nice. It's good. Excellent. Right. It's like, which word are you paying close attention to in that phrase?
Right,
That's
right.
good. Sister Janine, please.
Well, James Tarantino came out years ago with this movie about two hitmen,
Oh.
and the language in it was just vile, but the outcome of it was absolutely fascinating. And I brought it up, and one of my sisters-in-law absolutely had a fit. She said that was so disgusting, the language they used, it was just awful, and she just hated the movie. But I had thought, and I think Samuel L. Jackson then sort of converted. He stopped killing people or whatever. And the other guy had a ring or something from his father from the Korean War or some Vietnam War. Anyway, but it was really a fascinating story, but such a shock because they were killers. That was their job, And
right, but it's a shock only to certain folks, right? Because people talk like that.
Yeah.
Like people swear, people use all different sorts of language, and even church folks also, not to, I
even swore in church one day. I was
just
so mad.
Some church folks, right?
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, right? Like even the interpretive lens that we use, and I know I keep saying this over and over again, right? But it's an interpretive lens that we use about swearing, right? This is righteous, this isn't righteous, or whatever. Even when we talk, I'm going to get kicked out of these sessions, I promise you. Even when we talk about what does it mean to take the Lord's name in vain, right? If we did the same example in the Zoom chat about like, what do you think that means? Like, it's more than that. It's more than what probably the most popular answer would be in the Zoom chat, right? There's more ways to talk about that, but we've been socialized in such a way that we understand, like, you don't say these words in a row, or you don't use these particular words, right? And that gets folded in to the ethos and the culture of what it means to be church folks. And then anything that counters that, it's like, what? Or we don't even think that something would counter that, right? It just seems so common sense. I want to jump back real quick to something that Sister Marion and I were bopping back and forth about, like the idea that she brought forward that if there's something very significant like thou shalt not, it's because something's going on that they want to curb, right? They want to say, like, stop doing that thing. So we're going to say thou shalt not, right? And we're going to wrap it all into morals and ethics and religion or whatever, right? At the same time, like what I was saying is like, in the original thing, they knew why they didn't want to do that thing, right? They were like, we shall not, because blah, blah, blah. And a lot of times it comes down because we want to protect our families, or we want to act differently than the folks around us, or we want to be stronger or more moral or whatever, right? Favored by this God, whatever it is. But what happens over time is it gets wrapped into the just because we do that. And then nobody remembers what the original thing was. And one of the dangers around that is that if we can't remember what the original why was, then it could be a why that means nothing to us anymore. Or it could be a why that we know is harmful to us now. And yet we still perpetrate it over and over and over again because it's the thing that has just been wrapped right into whatever our ethos or culture is, right? So again, I think, you know, our conversation today has it bounced back and forth between like last week and this week. At the very same time, I think these are really rich conversations for us to have and wrestlings with to have, because they go beyond any particular story, right? It's how we're thinking about it, how we're wrestling with it, how we're doing it. Okay, last word, Sister Marion. And also, after you offer your last word, if you could offer the prayer, that'd be great. See what I did there?
I would say. Okay, I just wanted to say a word about last week's New York Avenue Presbyterian webinar with an author by the name of Peter Canellis, who's written a biography of Justice John Marshall Harlan called The Great Dissenter. And he was a member of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. It was a fascinating session last week. And one of the interesting aspects of the book is that there was this rumor, which still persists, that Harlan had a half brother who was Black. There was a Black man, 16 years his senior, who grew up in the household and even had the name. And it was very fuzzy as to who his father was. And what's interesting is that neither John Marshall Harlan, nor the purported brother shot down those rumors. So, but the DNA is questionable that they've taken with some of the dissent. Anyway, one of the things about Harlan and his dissents is that they became the basis for the arguments in the civil rights movement by Marshall and others. So his dissents have now become what we say should be the law. And it's just an important book. And I think you can go on the website for New York Avenue Presbyterian and watch that. And I really encourage everyone to do that.
Thank you so much. Tell me the name of the book again, please.
The Great Dissenter.
The Great Dissenter.
By Peter Canellis. And it was also a fascinating history about how Presbyterian denomination has been such an activist denomination. That's something I didn't know about until Metropolitan and New York Avenue started partnering together.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Would you pray our time out, please?
Tom wanted to say something. Tom, I thought Tom wanted to say something.
No, I was gonna ask Sister Miriam how's she doing? She's in Florida.
I'm in Florida, and the only good thing about the hurricanes in Florida is that all my friends check up on me. So thank you for checking up on me. And Florida is a peninsula and a panhandle. I'm in the panhandle. I'm in the far west. I'm 40 miles from Mobile. So Ian is south on the peninsula, going across the peninsula. So this time I'm spared. But thank you. We kept doing this all week to push it away, and it worked. It worked.
Well, I'd just like to say something about what Marion said about Harlan, that we've got a Lincoln pew, and we got a Lincoln room, but this is the first time that we've really looked at this guy doing this history about Harlan, and because he was looked at as kind of a wild, crazy guy. Oh, we don't have to pay any attention to him, but he was true to he kept at it. He never gave up. And I think that's the big message we all need, you know, as we face the many problems we've got now.
I mean, he said the
Come on.
Constitution is colorblind.
Yes, right. And that's what he said. Yeah.
And he gave talks at Metropolitan AME Church.
Yes. Oh, he went to, yeah. He went.
And when he died, there was a memorial service for him at Metropolitan and around the country in various Black churches, because Blacks followed his dissents very carefully. And Marshall and others said that, you know, if these horrible cases that were decided, Dred Scott, Plessy, if they had been unanimous, that just would have crushed hope that there were any white people who were going to stand up for the rights of Blacks.
Yeah.
All right, dear God. Dear God, thank you so much for this hour. Thank you for our inspiring leader. Thank you for all the participants and their wonderful ideas. Thank you for helping us become more thoughtful followers. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all so much.
Yes.
I'll be back at 7 p.m.
I will too.
So like double duty today. So
No, you're hard work.
Oh, they're great classes. Thank